Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day one of International Programs International Symposium. My name is Kevin Noe, and today it is my pleasure to introduce the session, Human Adaptation to Environmental Change, Then and Now. Before we get started today, I would like to remind everyone that there is a Q&A box down below. Please feel free to submit your questions there and have them answered by our panelists this afternoon. Additionally, after this session, there will be a brief survey through Zoom. So if you are able, please complete that survey. Finally, closed captioning is available also at the bottom of your screen. Now, I would like to begin by introducing Kathy Galvin, Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Africa Center at CSU.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and welcome everyone. As Kevin said, I'm Kathy Galvin, and I am going to introduce folks and moderate this session today. And our first speaker is Andrew Dew, and he's an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and Geography. In fact, that's where we all are. He studies the ecological factors that affected how hominin species are distributed in time and space in the African Pleistocene. And the title of his talk is How Humans and Mammals Responded to 4 million Years of Environmental Change in Africa. So I would like to turn this over to Andrew as our first speaker today, and I'll introduce the others as we make the transition from one PowerPoint to another. So Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. Okay, excuse me. Let's see, share screen. Boom. Okay, can everyone see my screen, hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Let me note the time. Okay, so thank you, Kathy, for that great introduction. It is a pleasure to be able to be a part of CSU's International Symposium and to be able to present really quickly some results for a research project I've been working on. So yes, today I'll be talking about how humans and mammals responded to 4 million years of environmental change in Africa. Okay, so today, humans are found all over the world. And because environments vary across the world, humans today live, survive in, thrive in all kinds of environments. And these include desert-like environments, the Arctic, tropical rainforests, and even New York City, the concrete jungle, okay? So this ability to live in all kinds of environments, this ecological versatility, is a defining human trait, okay? No other species living today, and probably even in the history of all life, is able to live in as many different types of environments as humans today are able to. And here you can see a suite of 3 of these ancient human species and the different types of environments that they lived in, okay? So as anthropologists, of course, naturally, we're interested in how or when did this trait, this ecological versatility, first evolve. But for this talk, I will address a more general question, which is how did environmental variability affect human evolution in general? And so I myself am interested in the earlier stages of human evolution. So in order to investigate human evolution many, many millions of years ago, there's only really one place on Earth that you can look at, and that's Africa. And so this is where the international part of my talk comes in. And so it is almost certain, almost all anthropologists agree on this, that the earliest human ancestors, human-like species evolved in Africa, and they didn't leave Africa until about 2 million years ago. So if you're interested in human evolution before 2 million years, the only place to look really is Africa. Okay, and in order to address this question of how environmental variability affected human evolution, we can use Potts's variability selection hypothesis as an interpretive framework. So if you're curious, this is what Rick Potts looks like. He's based at the Smithsonian Institution, and he's holding a stone tool known as an Acheulean hand axe. Okay, so we know environments and the larger climate has changed through time. And specifically what has happened is that climate and the environment has become more variable through time, okay? So here we have time going from older at the bottom to younger at the top, okay? Variability increases through time. And you could think of the curve when it swings to the left, you have warmer, more moist environments. When it swings towards the right, you have cooler, more arid environments. And what we see is, yes, more variable environments through time. So what do I mean by more variable? What we see is that the magnitude of the swings through time become, the magnitude increases. Okay, so in the beginning, you have climate kind of going back and forth a little bit, and then you get these more drastic swings through time. So you have really warm environments swinging all the way to really cool environments in more recent time periods. The frequency of swings also increases through time. So during older time periods, you might have this kind of steady clock-like swing. And as you go through time, that swing becomes more and more frequent, okay? Almost like a metronome speeding up, if you will. So we know environments have become more variable through time, right? Larger magnitude swings, higher frequency swings. How do species respond to this increased environmental variability through time? There are really 4 options, if you will. So one is that species can move. So as environment becomes more variable through time, these environments are shifting across space. Okay, if species are able to disperse and track these environments as they move across space, they can track their preferred habitat and survive and do just fine. Species can also evolve to become more ecologically versatile. So they can evolve to be able to persist in environments that are very warm and also environments that are really cool. So they can just stay at home, and as the environment shifts underneath their feet, they are fine. They can stay put, they'll survive. Species can also go extinct. So if the environment is shifting across space and species can't disperse fast enough to track that, they can become locked in an environment that they do not prefer, and thus populations will die out and the species will go extinct. And recently, POTS has added a 4th option, which is speciation. So as the environment shifts across space, you get habitat fragmentation, you get populations within a species that become isolated from each other. And if they become isolated long enough, they go on to each evolve into new species. Okay, so what was one species now branches off, for example, into 2. Okay, so for this talk, I will focus on these 2 species responses, speciation and extinction. And so specifically, I will show some results from a recent study that looks at and tests if higher environmental variability is associated with increased speciation and extinction in mammals. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, wait a second, I thought this was a talk on humans. Well, people who study what I study, it's very common to study the greater non-human mammal record. 2 main reasons. One is that the mammal record is more abundant and complete. And these ancient human species are really, really rare, really, really hard to find in the fossil record. For example, I've done many seasons of field work. I have yet to find my own ancient human species. Secondly, because these non-human mammals and humans existed in the same environments, existed in the same ecological communities, how the mammals responded to increased climate variability, for example, via speciation extinction, we can use that as a proxy for how these ancient humans would have responded. Okay, so I will show results from mammals, but don't worry, at the end, I will also show some data on humans and then kind of talk about how humans, these ancient human species may have responded to increased environmental variability. Okay, so first we have to collect the environmental variability data. This was done by the geologists on the research project. You can see all these multicolored circles are where the data are from. Okay, all kinds of environmental proxies, but some I want to highlight. For example, microscopic diatoms. These are a type of plankton found in ancient lake deposits that tell you whether the lake was more freshwater or saline in the past. You have these carbonate formations found in ancient soils. Okay, so that's the white here. There's a hammer for scale. Chemical analyses of these carbonates can tell us what the paleovegetation was like on the landscape. Same with ancient microscopic pollen. They also tell us the kind of vegetation that was on the landscape. And even things like these marine sediment cores. And so what happens is a ship goes off the coast of Africa. They drill deep down into the ocean floor, and they pull up the cylinder of sediment, which is a record of times of aridity and humidity in Africa. So for example, during times of aridity, there aren't many plants. The roots aren't there to anchor down the soils. So you get a lot of erosion and a lot of dust being blown off Africa into the ocean and thus recorded in these sediment cores. Okay, so the sediment cores tell us something about aridity versus humidity. Basically, the point of this slide is to show you that we have all kinds of environmental indicators telling us different things about the environment of the past. Okay, we also collect fossil data. This is something that's more in my expertise. Okay, we work with our African collaborators. We scour the outcrops looking for fossils. Sometimes if we're lucky enough, we find a patch of fossils on the ground. And we find really cool fossils, for example, like this one. This is a hippo forearm bone. Okay, so now to show you the results, African environmental variability increases through time. Okay, so we have lumped all of the data from all those different environmental proxies into one number. And what we can see is age goes from the right to the left. So on the right is about 4 million years all the way to the present. On the vertical axis is measure variability. And we can see that environmental variability has steadily increased through time in Africa. Regarding what the mammals are doing, what we find is that mammalian evolutionary rates do not increase through time. Okay, evolutionary rates being speciation rates, extinction rates. So time is oriented on the horizontal axis in the same way. And what we see is that speciation extinction rates are actually quite low and fairly constant through time. We do get this interesting extinction spike, the spike in extinction rates for reasons that we still don't know about. But in general, pretty steady through time, right? Definitely not tracking the increasing environmental variability through time that I showed you on the previous slide. So it seems like environmental variability and mammalian evolutionary rates are decoupled. And this is also substantiated with more formal statistical analyses. Okay, human evolutionary rates do not appear to follow environmental variability. So why did I put in do not appear? Well, as I mentioned previously, the human fossil record is notoriously incomplete and poor. And so there aren't enough data to robustly estimate speciation extinction rates. So what I've shown here instead is a suite of these ancient human species and their temporal ranges. So when they first appear in the fossil record, in this case for Homo erectus, and when they disappear. Now, if extinction rates increase through time, you would see a progressive winnowing of species as you go from older to younger time periods. You kind of see that, but not really. If speciation rates increased in these ancient human species, we would get an increased proliferation in the number of species through time. And we definitely do not see that. Okay, so human evolutionary rates do not appear to follow that increasing trend of environmental variability through time in Africa. Okay, so in conclusion, mammalian and human evolutionary rates were not associated with environmental variability. So it appears that humans did not exhibit or show any ecological versatility responses in terms of speciation or extinction. But that does not mean that these ancient humans did not respond to and were not affected by increased environmental variability. They could have just responded in different ways. For example, adaptations in their behavior or culture, things that would not be detected in the type of analyses that we did. And lastly, perhaps the most important point that I want to impart on you all is that the fossil record is the only direct evidence we have for human evolution. Okay, so we need to use the fossil record to directly investigate this larger question of how and when humans evolved ecological versatility, this very unique defining human trait. And thank you, that's it.
Well, thank you, Andrew. We do have a question for you, but we're going to wait till the end, till everyone has given their talks. So with that, I'd like to introduce Michael Ponte, and he's associate professor that studies the evolution of human carnivory over the last 2 million years in Africa. And the title of his talk today is Surviving the Savannah, How Human Ancestors Adapted to Environmental Changes in Africa.
Great, thanks, Kathy. Oh, looking for the share screen button, which seems to have vanished.
It's not at the bottom.
Oh, here it is now. Okay. All right, thanks, Andrew and Kathy, for that introduction. This is a great transition to my talk, which I'm going to be talking taking a more site-based approach to how you look at these questions. So how do we understand adaptation on the scale of an individual area of Africa? And one of the things that we see in Africa is an increasing shift to savanna environments from more wooded settings. So how do our ancestors respond to that? Well, the best place to look at these questions, in my opinion, is in East Africa at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. And I'm interested in a time period from 2 million years ago until about 1 million years ago, where we see the emergence of a new human species and an increasing reliance on stone technology. So Olduvai Gorge is so unique because it preserves this archaeological record over the last 2 million years. And it is part of the Rift Valley system of Africa, where we see an exposure of fossiliferous sediments that make it easier for us to find the fossils and concentrations that mark archaeological sites. So you can see there a picture of Olduvai from above, and this splitting of the surface and erosion due to rivers has exposed these fossiliferous sediments that are so important to understanding human evolution. And this graphic on the left, this shows you the time represented at Olduvai Gorge, and we mark it in layers that are tied to deposits of volcanic ash that we can date. Olduvai was really put on the map by Lewis and especially Mary Leakey, who had conducted research there since the 1950s and excavated almost 100 archaeological sites. Their biggest discovery was that cranium on the top right, the Zinjanthropus skull, and that's marked by the monument there today at the FLK archaeological site. And as important of this as this discovery was, because it was a new ancestor of humans called Zinjanthropus boisei at the time. The name has been updated since. The associated fauna and stone tools around that skull were just as important to tell us about the behavior of our ancestors and how they were adapting to these different environments. They also devised a way to date these deposits for the first time using radiometric methods, which pushed back what we knew to be the origins of human evolution to much older times, and in this case, 1.8 million years old, when we were thinking it was more like 500,000 years old before we had the dating techniques. So Olduvai, since Mary Leakey's work, we focused on looking at variation in behavior through time. And the way we do that is we excavate archaeological sites at different points in time that are important periods of human evolution. So here are 2 excavations that I helped complete. One at a site that's 1.7 million years old and marks really the last point in time where we have a species called Homo habilis at Olduvai Gorge, and a tool technology called the Oldowan, which is a really simple rock and flake technology, which most people probably won't even recognize as a tool to the untrained eye. Later in time, we have a site that is 900,000 years old, and we associate it with a different species, Homo erectus. And we see differences in not only the technology that are there, but also in how Homo erectus is using what the landscape has to offer them in terms of the animal foods that are present. So Homo erectus is important because it was the first species of human ancestor that had a brain that was somewhat larger, a body size that is similar to modern humans, and modern human limb proportions, where our earlier ancestors were generally tinier and had longer arms relative to their legs. Homo erectus also brought with it this Acheulean technology that Andrew mentioned, and this technology is important because it is a major advancement in how our ancestors were making tools. We don't know what these hand axes were used for, but certainly that some of the tools they were making were used to butcher animals. And this is how Homo erectus may have adapted to these savanna environments where plant resources became scarcer and the location of those became more patchy. So how do you substitute that in your diet? Well, you can rely on what is always around, animals, and getting access to the fat and meat within animals would have been a major advantage for Homo erectus when these savanna environments began to become more prevalent. So what happens when you get access to higher quality foods? Well, you can have a smaller gut because they're easier to process. And the fact that we have stone tools and potentially fire allows us to process animal foods very efficiently. We don't need to grow sharp teeth to eat those animals. We can use our generalized dentition as long as we have tools to do it. And then the extra nutrients can be put towards what is a very expensive tissue, brain. So to grow our larger brains, the fat and meat would have been extremely important. So how do we understand what Homo erectus is doing and how it differed from earlier humans? So you can see some examples here of our excavations at HEB. This is a site that Mary Leakey excavated in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And it's important because it's one of the only sites that is well preserved during this time period at Olduvai. On the bottom left, you can see Agostino Valencia, one of the most well-known fossil hunters in East Africa, trying to get out a partial arm of an extinct elephant. And this is associated with a partial skeleton and hundreds of stone tools. So this elephant skeleton took 2 years for us to remove, or 2 field seasons. And on the right, you can see cultural debris at a much lower level in the sequence at the same site. So humans were returning to these same areas over and over again over time. And these are really nice broken animal bones and Acheulean style tools. Some of them are hand axes. And one of the hand axes we discovered was over 1 foot long. So it makes you question what they could have been doing with tools that are this large and certainly heavy and difficult to manipulate. So what was Homo erectus eating? Well, we know even our ancestors at the 1.7 million year old site were eating animal foods. And we'd see that by small scratches on bones that are associated with removing flesh or disarticulation using stone tools. Here's an example of an elephant ankle bone that was removed. And you could see that it was probably due to disarticulation of the foot. And you can imagine an elephant foot being full of fat, and it's certainly a delicious meal to take home to your family. So you can imagine that it's like going to McDonald's and picking up a Big Mac. But we also want to know what our ancestors were doing in response to other organisms in the environment. So here is a tooth mark that we see on an antelope limb bone. And what it tells us is that this particular tooth mark is from a crocodile. So there's a risk of predation to our ancestors in these areas. But also they're in competition with not only crocodiles, but mammalian carnivores for these animal resources. So as humans are adapting and acquiring these resources, they're also going into competition with other species. And this has an impact on their prevalence in these different ecosystems. So, how did human carnivory affect the mammalian carnivores that were already in those environments. So all of this work is done through collaboration with the local communities and organizations that help this research project run. We share in the stewardship of the cultural heritage that is at Olduvai Gorge. This material is extremely important to understanding the evolution of our own species. And if you leave it out on the landscape, it can be lost forever or crushed. So it's important to recover and then store that material. We've provided resources and infrastructure to do that, and we've trained the local people and those that are in the organizations in the most modern methods available to recover and then analyze these important artifacts and fossils. So you can see there the large team that we have working in front of one of the labs that we built, which is all solar powered. There's no electricity other than solar out there. And some of the people that participate in the project, notably, we've trained dozens of people from the local Maasai communities and given them an income, and they've been important in the research that's conducted there. And we also train Tanzanian students and people who are working in these local organizations to use the technology that we bring with us. So you can see an example of that in the bottom right, where we're using a 3D microscope that was donated to our project. And each individual there gets training and then helps collect the primary data that we use in our analyses. So yeah, it's important to have buy-in from everyone in the local communities as well as the researchers that are participating, and that's the approach that we take there. With that, I thank everyone in attendance, and I'm happy to have been able to participate in this symposium. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. Really greatly appreciated. We'll move on to Mica. And Mica Glantz is a professor and chair in the department, and she studies Neanderthal dental morphology and paleobiogeography in Central Asia. And the title of her talk today is Where the Action Is, Admixture in the Central Asian Foothills. Thanks, Mica. You're on.
Thanks so much, Kathy, for the intro, and hello, everyone. I'm happy that you're interested in what we do and interested generally in international work. This slide is trying to do a lot, and I also think I date myself a little bit. If you're like me and grew up watching American Bandstand on Saturday, you'll recognize Dick Clark. And I didn't know this, but he had a show in the 60s called Where the Action Is. And I felt like that was a very fitting title for, in fact, my deep interest, which is what Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans were doing on the landscape about 100,000 years ago. So to me, the action really is in the foothills of Central Asia. And action is like, a sly word for having sex, because we know that all these folks were sharing mates and exchanging not only, I'm sure, important cultural information, but other biological things as well. So the other thing I want to say is that the idea of the symposium is to highlight, I think, the international aspects of our work. And Michael did a really nice job describing what we're doing in the field. And all of us, most anthropologists, work in an international framework. And we have colleagues that we design projects with, and we go abroad and are really part of the local communities. And to me, the thing I want to highlight for you is it's really a unique experience to go to a different part of the world, but to participate in a project with shared goals where people speak the same disciplinary language, that we know our topics intimately well, and we can approach them in these really so engaging international contexts. So that's my little speech on the international component of what I do, but let's keep going here. So for me, when we frame evolution, I really think of it in terms of people moving across space and encountering each other. So if I create a theoretical framework for my work, it really is to focus in on human mobility and what pushes and pulls human mobility. And of course, Andrew alluded to it in the beginning of our hour. It's really about environmental change or climate turnover that causes human groups to move. And I would argue that you could call this the foundation of human evolutionary change. So where I differ from Andrew and Michael is that I've moved out of Africa in my research, and I also do a much more recent period of history. So I'm interested in the last 200,000 years ago. And this is the period that people argue our own species emerged. And I look at the landscape also a little bit differently. So the next slide I'm showing you is an interesting perspective on the old world. And in this perspective, what's getting linked for you in the middle of the screen are the savanna environments of, let me see if I can do this, I want to get a little pointer thing, hold on. Maybe I can't do this. So if you can, if you can focus in on East Africa, you can see these sort of more arid landscapes linking up to what is modern day Yemen across Saudi Arabia, then through the middle of Asia to end right around Beijing. The area I work in is Central Asia. The countries are outlined in white here, but a lot of anthropologists refer to this as Savannistan or a super savanna highway. And one of the ideas that forms the basis of this is that when hominins left Africa, they were following similar ecosystems that they were adapting to in East and South Africa. Once they get into the higher latitudes of Eurasia, they're encountering different kinds of environmental stress, like cold, like extreme seasonality. They're also encountering different kinds of plants and animals on the landscape. So my work has really been about what is happening in Central Asia proper, because the genetic data that we're now consumers of as anthropologists suggests some very interesting things that we could never understand from the human fossils themselves. So in Central Asia, we know that 3 ancient human groups lived and encountered each other. One of them we call Neanderthals. Most of you know Neanderthals from sort of your ideas of quintessential cave people who are from Europe, that we typically think of them as being from Europe. We also have Denisovans on the landscape in Central Asia. And then we have early modern humans there as well. And so my questions about those 3 groups is how were they utilizing niches in this very diverse region that goes from deserts to steppes to foothills to high mountains? Were their adaptations to this landscape different from each other? We know some things about Central Asia that make the region different from both Europe and East Asia. We know that it in fact got much colder there and drier earlier in time than the last glacial maximum in Europe and then in East Asia. So the take-home message there is our ancestors in Central Asia were adapting to colder and drier conditions for longer periods of time than other groups across the continent. We also know, as I've suggested, that distinct genetic groups did encounter each other and share mates. So my questions have always been about where exactly on the landscape did they encounter each other and when in time. So this is my study region. I've done field work in Uzbekistan and also in southern Kazakhstan. But the region is the former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And they share a spine that cross-cuts from the southwest to the northeast of very high mountains. And this really does make for a distinctive environment where you have deserts on either side of those mountains, and then large connected steppe environments to the north of the mountains. And here I've mapped sites that occur during interglacial periods, which are typically warmer in Central Asia with less precipitation. And I've also mapped glacial period sites, and then those sites that exist on the landscape across those climatic periods. So the folks I work with, what we began to discern about this landscape is that much like the region we live in here in Fort Collins, the foothill environments were incredibly productive and preserved niche spaces that our ancestors could exploit, and it wouldn't matter if it was cold or warm. The foothill niches always had food and water. So here's a satellite map actually of the summer in Central Asia, but I'm using a summer map as a proxy for an interglacial period. And you could imagine when the when the environment is nice, you have our ancestors distributed across the landscape. And then when it gets colder and there's more precipitation, they coalesce into the niches that are more productive. And in my estimation, those niches are actually the foothills of these very high mountains that go to about 23,000 feet in altitude. And so there are lots of ways we can model population movement during these different climatic periods. You can, like if the arrows are all different human groups, red Neanderthal, green modern human, yellow Denisovan, during glacial periods, these groups coalesce and interact. In interglacial periods, they move out and they can interact in different parts of the landscape. And animals we know do very similar things. They move, we have evidence of them coalescing during cold periods in the southern part of Central Asia, and then dispersing from those areas to the north during interglacial periods. And I'm sure human groups were following this kind of animal movement as well. And so my final slide just shows you the map of the region again, with the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor highlighted for you in green. And this is the area that I really think was the stage for our ancestors' admixture. This is where they met, exchanged mates, possibly traded and learned from each other. And then they may have adapted to or moved into different niches during environmental periods that were warmer. So that's my story. And I will thank you, everyone. And I'm going to turn it over to Kathy so we can listen to Emily.
Thank you, Mica. That was really interesting. Really appreciate it. Our last speaker today is Emily Wilson, and she's an instructor in the department. Her interests include ancient and modern identities, migration and power in ancient Anatolia, which is Turkey, ancient Greek trade and itinerary, and she likes long walks on the beach. The title of her talk is Ancient Objects in the Modern Environment, the Case of White Supremacy and Polychromy, if I pronounced that correct. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks, everybody. So as Kathy mentioned, my research focuses upon ancient Greece and ancient Rome, which basically existed in the Mediterranean from about 1000 BCE to about 400 CE. So it's a time span of about 1500 years, give or take. It's a much shorter period than my presenter collaborators. This is also a world that is passingly familiar to many of you guys. If you have watched any of the plethora of movies that have come out recently, if you have read any of the Percy Jackson book series or the recent New York Times bestseller Circe, or even if you were passingly paying attention in middle school mythology. So it is the Greeks who built the Parthenon in Athens and who conceived of the first Olympics in 776 BCE. And it is the Romans who created one of the largest empires, who watched gladiatorial contests in the Colosseum on the right, and who tragically occupied the city of Pompeii when Vesuvius, which is right here, exploded in 79 CE. So my talk today is actually somewhat different than my colleagues. I want to focus not so much upon the built or the natural environment, but actually upon our modern cultural environment and consider what the Greco-Roman world's place is within it. So as such, I'm going to be exploring two different themes that seem quite distinct, but are in fact actually fairly intertwined. That of Greco-Roman sculpture, as you see in several of the largest museums in the world, and that of white supremacy. So let's start in Charlottesville. On August 11th, 2017, a crowd of white, mostly young and mostly male individuals gathered around the statue of Robert E. Lee on the University of Virginia's campus to protest its removal. The next day, James Field drove his car into counter-protesters, killing one individual. And among the many calls, both at the protest and then the counter-protests the next day, was that traditional America is under attack. And there was a call to arms that is essentially necessary to protect this America. And it's this traditional, and I use traditional in quotes, America that is distinctly white, and it's one in which white men are dominant over every other social group, whether based on race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, kind of that whole gamut, given essentially a belief in white superiority and white supremacy. And Charlottesville has been just one incident, but these white supremacist ideologies are very much on the rise in America over the past decade or so. All right, so what does that have to do with ancient Greece and ancient Rome? Let's return again to these posters and these images of some recent movies. Notice how this world is portrayed. How many white people do you see in these posters? This is because the Greek and the Roman world in our modern imagination tend to be white, and they tend to have accents that generally come from majority white countries, so Australian, British, Scottish. And indeed, if you look at these posters of white supremacist group Identity Europa, you'll notice that they use ancient sculptures. So from left to right, this is Julius Caesar right here. This is his right-hand man, Mark Antony right here. And this is the god of the sun, Apollo on the right. So the question then becomes, how did these sculptures and emblems of the ancient world get co-opted and put into service for white supremacy? All right, so to answer this, we need to go back a bit. For the past 300 years or so, a really good, proper education in the Western European and even American elites was a classical one, so Greco-Roman, AKA knowing and reading ancient Greek and Latin texts, such as the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, reading plays such as Oedipus Rex and Medea, or the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. So important were these texts that Heinrich Schliemann, so this is this gentleman on the left, a German businessman who actually discovered the site of Troy because he read the Iliad and figured out where it was based on the Iliad's descriptions. He actually slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow every single night. It's so sad. Or Thomas Jefferson, who should be familiar to many of you guys on the right. He apparently died with a copy of the Roman philosopher Seneca open on his bedside table. Another part of this classical education is essentially embarking on travel, usually for about a year, maybe 2 or 3 years, to these ancient lands, especially Italy, Sicily, and if it was open via the Ottomans, to Greece as well. So this is what we call the Grand Tour, and was called the Grand Tour. And it was during this time that aristocrats would essentially tour temple ruins. They would gaze upon ancient statuary or skeletons and visit notable sites. So this is the Pantheon in Rome. This is Pompeii right here. And this is just another lithograph from Pompeii. And it's during this time that these aristocrats would also pick up mementos of their journeys abroad. So this included paintings, statuary, pieces of walls, even mummies. So for example, if any of you guys are fans of Downton Abbey, if you visit the castle, Highclere Castle, if you go into the basement, there is actually a collection of ancient Egyptian objects. They were all collected by Lord Carnarvon, who is the man who financed Howard Carter, who discovered King Tut. And all of these objects were brought back from his travels through Egypt. And it's also these private collections of ancient artifacts that eventually will form the base of the collections of national museums when they were donated to the state upon the death of that individual collector. So, for example, the Elgin marbles, which originally decorated the Parthenon in Athens, they're in the British Museum today because Lord Elgin donated them when he had to declare bankruptcy. So, the fundamental importance placed upon this Greco-Roman world by these elite, who you have to remember are the politicians, they're the heads of states, they're the titans of business. They're actually paralleling the use of ancient Greece and ancient Rome to set national ideologies and identities of Western European countries. So, for example, England is using the Roman Empire as justification for its own empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. And American democracy, the founding fathers looked to Athens and Athenian democracy when they were writing our own constitution. Okay, so you really need to make sure that you are aware that this world is being used by these elites, by these heads of states, that, or rather to justify the racism, colonialism, and imperialism that has upheld white people in positions of privilege and power for the last couple hundred years. And it really does seem like this ancient world was white. So in fact, we have evidence of it. If we look at these Parthenon marbles, so again, this is a drawing based on the earliest incarnation of the British Museum. We also have the Laocoon right here, the Discobolos, the Venus de Milo, the Nike of Samothrace, and the Apollo Belvedere. And the skin of these statues is white, white, white. And their aesthetic beauty has been taken as proof in the past of white superiority in the past and brought into the present. So one of the best examples of this is actually the work of Josiah Knott, all right? He was an American doctor, he was a Confederate, and he was a holder of enslaved persons. And he's really interested in craniometry, the study of skulls and basically skull proportions, and used those craniometric studies, and studies in quotation marks, to essentially argue for white superiority and this idea that Black people and white people are two very different races. And what I've given you here is an illustration from his book, which is called The Indigenous Races of the Earth. And you'll see that he actually used craniometry taken from a classical sculpture, the Apollo Belvedere, and he uses this as evidence for white supremacy and white perfection. So what I really hope to have argued and illustrated here in this very quick kind of spin through the last 200 or 300 years is that there is a centuries-old tradition of using Greco-Roman statuary, texts, and material culture to uphold and justify more modern racism and white supremacy. All right, so let's switch gears very briefly to talk about archaeology and preservation conditions. So as any gardener who has moved from Colorado or to Colorado and tried to garden here, you'll notice that soil affects and differs from place to place. And this is no different with material culture. So this is what happens when you pull material culture out of soil that has degraded the surface. So this is actually glass, this is iron, and this is a bronze coin. Okay, and this is no different than what happens to the surface of marble statuary. Essentially, marble statuary comes out of the ground, especially in Mediterranean soils, which tend to be acidic, and they look white. So these are older excavation photos, and here are more modern ones. But what we need to keep in mind is that these marble sculptures are in fact painted. So I just want to take you through very quickly one particular example. This is the Alexander sarcophagus. And this actually has painting that is very vividly preserved. So here is a really quick idea. What I've shown you is the image from clothing on the legs as well as blood right here. And in this particular person, this is Alexander, you can see not only his original head cap, all of the clothing paint, but even painted breastplate and horse trappings. What that means
sorry,
is
Emily,
yep, give me 1 second, I'm almost done. In reconstructions, what we need to keep in mind is that marble statuary from this world is polychromatic, it is painted. This is what it looks like. And by reclaiming this painted surface back as not white, we can pull it away from the white supremacists and reclaim it into our modern world. So in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap it up there, but thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much, Emily. I wish we had more time. That was extremely fascinating. So sorry to jump in there at the end, and I appreciate you speeding us along. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and presenters today. We truly enjoyed this session on human adaptation. Again, International Programs International Symposium will continue today, tomorrow, and Thursday. Please join us for additional sessions. And if you have a moment, as we close out this Zoom session, take a minute to complete the survey that will be presented. Again, thank you to all of our presenters and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Fantastic. Good work.